Hello, I'm Roberta Winters, President of the League of Women Voters of Radnor Township. As you may know, the League's purpose is to promote political responsibility through informed and active participation in government. This purpose brings me back here again today. The Garrett Hill overlay is a topic which is under discussion in Radnor Township. Just what is this area and how did it happen to come into existence? And what can we learn from the past to help us guide our decision making in the future? Hopefully, I'll have someone with me today who can help us understand a little bit more about this community and how our vision became a reality through this overlay process. Many of you will recognize our guest today, Anne Minicozzi, who is a regular producer here on Mainline TV 21. She has also been instrumental in nurturing the Community Unity Coalition, of which we are, as a League of Women Voters, very much involved. Welcome, Anne. It's a pleasure to have you here with us today. And can
Thank
you
you.
tell us a little bit about how you know about Garrett Hill?
All right. Well, first of all, I want to thank you for having me on the program. And one of my favorite topics, I guess, in my life is Garrett Hill. My husband and I have lived in Radnor Township for 30 years, and we as a family with our two children lived in Garrett Hill for 12 years. And now we just barely don't live in Garrett Hill. We're just like a mile away. So we're still in Radnor Township and enjoy Garrett Hill very much. And another sort of piece of history is in 1995, I ran for commissioner for 7th Ward in Garrett Hill. And that was also the year of the 75th anniversary of a woman's right to vote. So a fundraising event that we had for my commissioner race was on August 26th, and just a backyard fundraiser. And actually, Representative Greg Vitale helped me out with learning how to be a candidate and things like that. But I had the greatest time going door to door in Garrett Hill in Ward 7-2, which is where I was, and then 7-1 also. And I literally knocked on every door a couple of times because that's what you're supposed to do. And just chatting with everybody and just getting to know what people's concerns were in our neighborhood. But also in terms of Garrett Hill itself, my husband and I wanted to buy a house in Garrett Hill because it's so family oriented. You can walk right to the park. It's a residential community with the small business district, which is great. And the scale and size of the community, the people, the 4th of July parade is, that's a highlight, especially when you're getting ready to have children. You want to go to the 4th of July parade and have the hot dogs after that, and the bike decorating contest, which my children participated in, and all of that. So I'm a big fan of Garrett Hill, and I guess a champion of Garrett Hill also, because I wrote a newspaper column for 11 years, and as part of writing those columns, I also wrote about Garrett Hill during the time of the Garrett Hill Coalition.
Wow.
So that's some points, but yeah.
That's a lot of history. And I can remember that 75 years ago when the League was 75 years old. Now we're 100 years old. So it has been a while since you ran for office, but I still remember you knocking on my door because you were actually my neighbor way back then.
Yep.
So it's really great to have you with us, and particularly someone who's been a champion for Garrett Hill and was involved in many of the events that have happened in the past. Did you happen to cover what was happening when we did that overlay district a while ago?
Yes, but even earlier than that, there was the Comprehensive Planning Steering Committee for the township. And because I was from Garrett Hill, it was open to the public, but I was from Garrett Hill, so I was able to say some things about that. And I think I was, among a few people who came from Garrett Hill. A whole bunch of residents were from Wayne. So with all of that balance of representation, it was kind of a creative process. I think it was called a charrette, where you go around and answer different questions like, what are the boundaries of the neighborhoods in Radnor Township? what are the faith institutions in Radnor Township, and things like that. So I remember at that time, so this is earlier, we were talking about what are the boundaries of Garrett Hill, of that neighborhood community. And so I was able to speak to that in terms of my input. And but I think it's just so important to have all different representatives from the township on these kinds of township wide efforts. Because I remember in particular, I still remember this. Um, I mentioned that there was a historic church in Garrett Hill, Radnor United Methodist Church, and that's actually where the Community Breakfast Collaborative, that's where we have our offices. And there was someone who was very well informed, a member of the Historical Society, the Radnor Historical Society, which is a great organization that we have, who said they didn't realize that Radnor United Methodist Church existed in Radnor Township, and it's founded in 1780. So it was really important to have full participation from everyone in Radnor Township on that effort. And then more specifically to your question about the more recent Garrett Hill overlay, I remember that happening, that process starting to happen. And I remember sort of the part right before that. And again, it was primarily a committee comprised of residents of Wayne and St. David's, but sort of West Radnor Township, talking about what kinds of plans they would like to see happen in Garrett Hill. And there was even a small group of volunteers who were doing this on the advisory boards. And they had a walk around Garrett Hill and they were pointing at different things that they would change and things like that. But there wasn't at that time in that small group anybody from Garrett Hill involved. And so the changes that they were proposing were really out of step, as it turns out for sure, once the Garrett Hill Coalition formed and came to be a body that could articulate, this is what we want to have for our community, and this is who we are, actually, emphasizing the family aspect of Garrett Hill, the really the close neighborhood relationships that we have in Garrett Hill, that you can walk to the park, and then I'm restating a couple things, the great parade and all of those things. So those things were missing when people were walking around and really needed more input. So, as when you're talking about Garrett Hill, you really need people from Garrett Hill, the residents involved. And at that time, I was writing a newspaper column, which turned out to be, I was writing it for 11 years. This was for Mainline Life. So we used to have 3 local papers. Now we have 1.
Yeah,
And I went through that consolidation process through that time. But the first column I actually wrote for Mainline Life was about the Garrett Hill 4th of July parade. That was the very first column that I wrote, because I started sort of in the first month was July, and I wrote about the parade. But in terms of the Garrett Hill Coalition, once there started to be some township discussion, hey, we want to have some changes in Garrett Hill, then people in Garrett Hill started to mobilize, and in such a well-organized way. And so many people, over 100 people were active for sure. And so while I was writing my newspaper column, what I tried to do, since we've acknowledged I'm a champion of Garrett Hill, is to write, to kind of chronicle those activities. I wasn't a major player in those activities because just by that time we had just moved just to a little bit bigger house, and a mile away. But I tried to chronicle all that activity as best as I could. And there were Save Garrett Hill signs and the naming of the Garrett Hill Coalition, and then all of that activity. And it worked so wonderfully with the township too. I'm also really fond of our township, because the Garrett Hill Coalition worked really well with the township government, commissioners, and so forth, to make the overlay happen. That's the overlay for the most part that residents wanted in Garrett Hill.
Well, I know I had a slide of the overlay district, and although a lot of people have different ideas of what encompasses Garrett Hill, the overlay district only refers to a specific part of Garrett Hill. And that was the part that included some of the auto dealerships right off Conestoga Road, the corporate center, some of down to the beverage store and back up where those small industrial areas are, just right behind Garrett. And then across, and it includes Tennell Field because as you know, the parks are very important to us and then comes back around. So it's really a very small district, but it's where there was a lot of mixed use. And I
Yes.
think that's the way Garrett Avenue and our Garrett Hill area has always been in terms of mixed use. And I also wanted to mention to you that I'm really glad that you realized how many people were involved in this Garrett Hill project. I can remember I used to be a part of a team that used to give out flyers so everybody knew what every meeting was going to be and where it was going to be and what time it was and what we were going to discuss. And I'm sure you remember that there was a team that, made an effort to communicate. And those meetings, as you said, were not small meetings. And it wasn't just the residents who were involved. I think there were business people. There was a lot of people there.
Yeah, I think I was primarily saying the residents, but the business community was definitely involved. And so I really think, even in terms of a strategic planning municipal effort, if you compared what happened in Radnor Township to other efforts, I think it was such a successful articulation of needs and desires, and then it ended up being a good fit. And there were things, you learn things like what's a setback, how much front lawn or space between the house and the street, that's the setback. You learn so much. I learned so much vocabulary going through these kinds of processes. Um, but also because Garrett Hill has such the, the bulk of it is a residential community, then you want to have the business community in scale to that, but the residents definitely hugely support the businesses and frequent the businesses all the time. So I wondered also, Roberta, if we should say in terms of history that in 1992, the elementary school was closed and was sold to become the Rosemont Business Campus. So the residents of Garrett Hill, that was also a big reason why we wanted to buy a house here in Garrett Hill as well, was to be literally down the street from the elementary school. And then we realized that it was going to be closing. But I know from my neighbors at that time that the elementary school was available in the day as a school, of course, but then in the evenings and weekends as a community center. There was community theater, all kinds of space available for the residents to get together, which we're missing now, I feel. That's been a loss for a while now, but that's something that happened early on. So I feel like that's part of the context of what makes Garrett Hill such a great community. But that part is missing.
Yes, and actually it was 40 years ago when Rosemont School closed. And I just recently had an interview with Dr. Crosby, who was involved as the superintendent. And I actually taught at Rosemont School. Maybe you didn't know that
I
before it
did.
closed. So it was an important part of the community. And I think we value our community. And I think that's why the sentiment is so strong about preserving many of the things that were important to us. And I think one of the things that's always been a problem in Garrett Hill is the traffic on Garrett Hill. And I'm sure you've had experiences there going up and down. It's kind of narrow, right?
Yep. Yep. Yeah, on Conestoga, and then even the heavier traffic on Williams, which changes to Garrett when you cross Conestoga, and then even on Wentworth Lane running into Summit Terrace. If you're coming through the Beaupre area and up Wildhaven, a lot of people will circle around Lewis and then cut to Wentworth. So that ends up being a through street. So yeah, traffic has always been something that, you wanted to try to manage.
And I think when you go down Garrett, if there's a snowplow coming down the other direction or a garbage truck, forget it. There's no way you're going to get through with that car. So
Yep.
I think that road is rather narrow. And I think one of the things that, we tried to do when we talked about trying to help our neighborhoods was the thing like maybe limit the trucks because that's always been a challenge. And maybe, even wider sidewalks, but because that area was developed before zoning, the telephone poles are in the middle of the sidewalk and the lanes that we drive are so narrow, so that to make those kinds of changes would require a lot of money because you're not going to just move all the utilities to the backyards or put them underground. It's really a challenge. But
Yep.
it's part of the neighborhood and it's the way that's been because it was built up before there was zoning and before setbacks and things were in in code. So people just built and many of those places were, built decades ago.
Yeah, there are a number of things that are grandfathered in. For instance, the businesses that are behind Conestoga Road and Garrett. Um, you wouldn't necessarily have that kind of thing now if you were planning it. But that's just, we have businesses tucked in there. Yeah.
Do you remember some of those tours? Did you ever take a tour of Garrett Hill where we talked about the history and how it sort of, you can actually tell from like where the church was from that period of time, the 1700s, to, when the estates were there and people had the homes along our neighborhoods where people who worked in the estates lived and how they were designed and then how, post-war development happened and then, more suburbia developed around it. So you can actually see the transition of how a neighborhood developed over time from a real historical beginning to contemporary times.
Yeah, I've never gone on a tour, but I know exactly what you're talking about. When you walk from where I used to live and walking over to the park, you could see like where I lived would have been the older houses, and then how the newer ones were built on the other side of Lewis, and then kind of sweep down on those the great roads. Like Wildhaven is such a nice road to walk on or drive on, the way that it is kind of serpentine. So that was an estate there as it leads down to the Ithan Creek. So just walking through or driving through, you can notice the different types of housing. And I know we're kind of saying, I mean, I still am fond of Garrett Hill because of the different mix of housing and how you can see that history. It's interesting, and it's kind of like what we humans do. Unless you're in some kind of open space where you're planning a development, and then everything is more, or it can be more generic. Um, but I just think Garrett Hill is well, I think it's just charming and it's a gem, and it also deserves the care. The
Well, I
care.
think, when we were looking at Garrett Hill, there was a lot of talk about supporting development, but also maintaining character. And that's a sort of a delicate balance. And there are things like affordable housing, which is important. And I know, from my experience, many of the people who were teachers, who worked at Villanova, people who were nurses, you know, that's an area where people can afford to live.
Yep. Yep.
And we don't have many affordable houses left in our communities.
Yep. And so that's important to try to maintain that as well. I remember walking past someone's house in our neighborhood and how they would play music in their house. This particular person was an artist, a painter, and they would have the music, classical music, on at full volume while he was painting. He was a prominent painter. And so, yeah, just some great people, and theater people, and all kinds of interesting people in the neighborhood.
Well, the other thing we talked about a lot was height. Do you remember the height? Because that was one of the things we're talking about, character. And there's a lot of people who feel that things that are too tall sort of change the look of a street when you go down it, and also impacts things like traffic or parking and all those other issues. Do you remember those height discussions? I think those are pretty heated.
Yep, yep. Even the more recent ones on the property on Garrett, and trying to keep the height to a reasonable scale so that it is in scale with the other houses in Garrett Hill. But yeah, there are some anomalies that you really do want to keep that in check to keep the the neighborhood looking consistent.
Well,
Yeah.
I know we talked about things, and you mentioned them already, things like having a certain lot size and having setbacks that were appropriate, certain coverage of the properties, certain paved areas and so forth, and things that weren't allowed other places in Radnor happened in Garrett Hill because of the nature of the neighborhood and the characters you said that was historic and showed the kind of development that's gone on and on over time. Do you remember anything about parking? Because that's always been a challenge for some of our commercial areas and just the little stores and even the fish market and things like that. Parking seems to be a challenge.
Yep, and I think that it is a challenge. I do think that I compare it to, and I did write a column about this also, comparing the Wayne Business District, the Ithan Business District, and I live closer over that way now, um, and then the Garrett Hill Business District. For the most part, just talking about Ithan, people are coming in, picking up their dry cleaning or their food, and then leaving. So those businesses that are similar in Garrett Hill, there's probably enough parking for those. But then any of the businesses where people are staying a little bit longer, like the bar restaurants, things like that, uh, would need some more parking. But I wonder again, going back to the history of the elementary school being there, there's plenty of parking there at what's now the Rosemont Business Campus. But as far as I know, there's never been any kind of formal arrangement of parking sharing during maybe off hours or evening hours. I don't know about that. So there's plenty of space and parking spaces already demarcated that if there were some sharing that way, that would be, and I'm one person with one opinion, that would be an easy solution,
I think
figure
they
that
talked
out
a
on our
lot about
program.
sharing parking because that would help a lot. And the other thing was talked about is maybe, having diagonal parking into the streets, but that would again require changes in the sidewalks and some of the front setbacks. But they were even talking about things like, putting bump outs on the sidewalk. So, it could be easier for like people who want to sit outside and eat, but sharing the parking in the neighborhood so that, it wasn't even limiting the parking like to 30 minutes in some places and longer parking in other places.
Yep. Yep.
So there were lots of ideas, but implementing them is another thing.
Yeah, and the overlay, I guess, is about 10 years old now,
Hmm.
and the parking seems like it needs to be more addressed now. But with all of these things, there's only so much you can address at a time. And now that certain aspects have been addressed and are already implemented, maybe now is the time to look at a parking study. And that's another great thing about our township and our township staff also is doing studies and also learning from what other communities have done. There's so much information out there and excellent examples of how others in other townships have implemented these things like diagonal parking, that it could be really lovely, the kinds of changes that you could make that could help the business district to have more space. And if you can move short-term and long-term, longer-term parking elsewhere.
Right. And I know we even talked about having one, Garrett Hill go one way and Lowry's go another way, have one-way streets to help with that traffic flow. And also we even added those speed bumps so people weren't zooming down Garrett Avenue. So there are a lot of things that other communities have done. I remember we looked at Meteor as an example of some of the things that you can do in those neighborhoods. So I think, we've made a lot of progress since the overlay district. And I know a lot of areas on Garrett Avenue and in the neighborhoods have been developed because of the kinds of changes that were made. And I
Mm-hmm.
think, as you said, Anne, it's always good to relook and restudy and see what needs to be done. But I find, it's kind of exciting that we even talked about other transportation changes, like, what was happening at the P&W station. Remember that? And
Yep.
how it'd be nice if it was handicapped accessible and how it would be, nicer for people to come in and out of our community through public transit as well as driving here and there, bike paths even.
Yep. And even recently, the stations have been improved at Villanova. And so now, just moving down a little bit east, they have a design and they might just be able to implement that. Um, I wanted to say also in terms of all of this planning, because this overlay is only 10 years old. And I know at the town hall meeting, one person was talking about, you want to change these things every couple years or something like that. I think you want to really take your time and study and plan and get full community input on these things. But I will bring up the late Steve Palantonio, who I'm sure you knew as well. We were talking about something. He was on the library board with me too. But in terms of planning, and he said, Anne, I'm not talking about short term, I'm talking about 50 years from now. So, what would everybody in Garrett Hill and the businesses, the residents, everyone, and even, in terms of a study, you want to have people who live nearby as well, survey everybody. What would everybody like Garrett Hill to look like 50 years from now? And I bet they would say very similar to now, but maybe, a little calmer traffic, a little more parking, and things like that. So I'm thinking of Steve there, who did so much work,
Well, I think
you know,
comprehensive long range planning is a great idea. And while we're talking about that, we have lots of planning to do, but we're running out of time today, Anne. So I wanted to thank you so much for joining me today and sharing your recollections of Garrett Hill and how we continue to work to plan and make it a better place for people to live and also businesses to thrive. So thank you again. And of course, I'd love to thank Mainline TV 21, who continues to host our programs and help keep us informed in our community about what's happening in and around our neighborhoods. So I hope everyone who's involved will stay involved and keep in touch so that we can continue to keep learning and make a difference. The League of Women Voters hopes you'll continue to join us in the important work we do, not only locally, but state and nationally. So we wish you well, take care, and stay well. Thank you again.
thank you.